All right, welcome to the space, everybody. Today is February 27th. I'm Lasara Firefox Allen with Pacific Center for Human Rights or for Human Growth, sorry, and we will be holding the space with advocates for trans equality today for Know Your Trans Rights. Um, we are going to kick it off in just a minute, but I'm going to give folks a moment to continue arriving before we dive into the slide deck. And thank you all for showing up. We expect to have around 250 people in the room today. So again, we'll just give it a few more minutes to let folks arrive. Welcome to the space. All right, yeah, you can leave it on the Glow. You can leave it on the recording slide for now, just so folks know as they come into the space. Thank you. So the reason that we're recording this today is because we had a number of people who could not be here, and also folks were like, this is really important information for folks to have. And so we would like to make it available to as many folks as we possibly can. And so we are going to be posting it on our YouTube channel and making it possible for folks to access it ongoingly. And we still have people coming into the room, so I'm going to continue holding for just another moment, and then we will dive into the slides. Okay. All right. Okay, seems like we've reached a lull. Glow. Do we want to dive in? Does that seem like, oh, as more people join? um, okay. Okay, we're going to dive in then. So just to start with, just know that this is going to be recorded. As I said earlier, we will be posting the video to our YouTube channel so that folks will have access to the information in perpetuity. Um, so Pacific Center welcomes advocates for trans equality today with huge gratitude for all that A4TE does for the community. I'm Lasara Firefox Allen. I'm the executive director at Pacific Center, and with Glow, our training program manager, who will be handling the tech and support aspect, we're here to help facilitate the space today. So for those of you who are not yet familiar with Pacific Center, we're a community-based mental health and peer support organization that serves the LGBTQIA plus community in Alameda County, California, and beyond. Founded in 1973, we're the third oldest queer-serving nonprofit in the country, and we're the oldest in the Bay Area. We have a number of programs. Please check out our website at pacificcenter.org and come visit if you're in the Bay Area at any point. We're in the East Bay. And we're grateful to partner with Advocates for Trans Equality to bring you this opportunity to learn more about how this administration is impacting trans lives and trans rights. So Advocates for Trans Equality, A4TE, fights for legal and political rights for transgender people in America. Leveraging decades of experience on the front lines of power, we shift government and society towards a future where we are no less than equal. A4TE was founded in 2024 as the National Center for Transgender Equality, NCTE, and Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, LDEF, two longtime champions in the trans community, merged together as one organization. A4TE builds on their successes to boldly imagine a world where trans people live our lives joyfully and without barriers. In a time of increased extremism against trans people and our allies, protecting and expanding our freedom to be who we are has never been more important. So the agenda today is going to be passport updates, military ban, and healthcare attacks. Those are going to be the areas that we're going to be covering. Olivia Hunt will be covering those for us, and I will introduce Olivia in just a moment. So Olivia Hunt, she, her, is A4TE's Director of Federal Policy. Olivia works with national coalition partners and government officials to craft policies on issues affecting transgender people. Prior to joining A4TE, Olivia served as an Equal Justice Works AmeriCorps Legal Fellow at Whitman Walker Health in Washington, D.C., where she oversaw their name and gender marker change program serving transgender clients throughout D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. She has also worked in the fields of international election law, corporate law, and municipal law. And I just want to say I've heard Olivia speak on a number of occasions and always come away enriched by the experience, feeling that I had a much better grasp on what I've been wondering about. So I'm looking forward to more of the same today. So welcome to the space, Olivia. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you. It's fantastic to be here. I wish the circumstances were a little more optimistic and positive than the one we're facing, but it has definitely been a very hectic and stressful 6 weeks in trans people's lives across the country. As folks are probably really well aware, from day one of the second Trump administration, pardon me, I've also been fighting a bit of a cough, which is going to make today kind of interesting. So from day one of the second Trump administration, we've seen what seems like an unending wave of attacks against our community. The very first of those was an executive order issued at about 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time on January 20th that purported to declare that the US government would only recognize two specific sexes, which are defined in a binary fashion, that are considered to be immutable and have a definition that is medically and scientifically nonsensical. This was one of those things where we saw it come out, had to read through it a few times to really understand exactly what they were trying to do, because it was just so poorly structured and so poorly written. But eventually, A4TE partnered with 15 other organizations to put out an explanatory document, which I'm linking in the chat, that walks through kind of point by point what that executive order is trying to do, how it works, and what it gets kind of fundamentally wrong about how the law works. Now, we were all kind of wondering that evening, what is the first impact of this going to be? And, for those of us who had put our money on passports, that was the answer. In fact, probably the most remarked upon, most widely noted impact that the Trump administration had in its first 2 weeks on trans people was on the issuance of passports. The Biden-Harris administration on their way out had actually authorized a significant amount of overtime at the passport agency, which trans people across the country took advantage of to get documents updated. In fact, I'm one of those folks who renewed my passport relatively late in the Biden-Harris administration in order to maximize my time with one that had the correct gender marker on it. Beginning on Tuesday, January 21st, the passport agency abruptly stopped issuing passports with corrected gender markers to trans people. Unfortunately, because this policy was not implemented in any sort of structured, reasonable, or logical way, they were just issuing a stop order to all frontline staff working at the passport agency. We wound up in a situation where, well, it was chaos. Nobody knew for sure what was going on. Nobody within the State Department could answer what was going on. It was unclear, were trans people just barred from getting passports, or were trans people only able to get passports that had the gender marker that had their sex assigned at birth on it? If they had already updated their passport, would they have it revoked and a new one issued? We've now come more than a month since then, and we now kind of have an idea of what that landscape is looking like. Passports right now for trans people, actually, you know what? I'm going to nerd out for a second. I'm going to get historical here. So prior to 2010, from about I think it's the mid 90s or early 90s to 2010, in order to get your gender marker changed on your passport, you had to have proof of having had what we now call bottom surgery. Well, at the time they would have called sex reassignment surgery or a sex change. Basically genital surgery that some trans people will have as part of their medical transition. And you had to provide proof of that either from a surgeon or from a medical provider who would certify that they had verified that you had had that surgery. And that was the only way that you'd be able to get your gender marker changed on your passport. Starting in 2010, the Obama-Biden administration put out a new version of the rule that required a standard that we will refer to as medical certification. And basically, a doctor had to provide a certified letter, or certified letters is not technically accurate. They had to provide a certification in the form of a letter that contains specific language stating that you had received what they said appropriate clinical treatment for gender transition. Appropriate clinical treatment being kind of a vague term, but deliberately so, because not everybody has access to the same medical care. Not everybody wants the same medical care. Just the general goal was basically making sure that people were able to get their documents updated, provided they had had whatever care was appropriate for them. That was the rule from 2010 until the Biden-Harris administration, which early on adopted a new rule that moved to the standard that we call self-attestation, where they would just basically take your word for it. They would trust that you know your gender better than the person at the passport agency. So it allowed you to select your gender marker on the passport application form, and then it would be issued in that gender. They also adopted new forms that allowed for an X gender marker as a possibility, which is a process that had first become possible in 2017 when the District of Columbia began to issue driver's licenses with an X marker. That was the process that we had for about 3 years. And it ended abruptly on January 21st. And now they went back to a pre-1990s standard. Nope, you just can't change your gender marker on your passport. Now, one of the questions that will often come up when we're having this discussion about passports is why on earth does a passport even have a gender marker on it in the first place? And the answer to that is basically international law. There is a treaty that the US is a party to that governs how passports are structured, how they're issued, and what material on them, which is why, regardless of what country issues it, a passport looks broadly the same. It has a lot of similar characteristics, no matter who gave it to you. As a result, one of the requirements of that treaty is that it has to have a gender marker on it. It doesn't specify what the gender markers have to be. It doesn't specify that it has to be M or F. It doesn't specify that it has to be MF or X. In fact, there's actually a wide variety of gender markers that are put out by different nations to recognize non-binary people or intersex people, or in some cases, just giving the option to really have a gender marker effectively on your passport by allowing it to say undisclosed or something along those lines. So it's kind of a broad landscape, but it comes down to there just needs to be one there because of international law. And as folks know, folks probably know, treaties have the same force of law in the US as the US Constitution. So there has to be one by that standard of law. So what we've seen come out over the course of the past few weeks, and by the way, I do apologize for the digression if I lost anybody during that. I do this a lot. Sorry, it's just how I give these kinds of presentations. So what we have managed to confirm as of today on how passports work. Passports will be issued to trans people, but they will only allow you to have a passport with your gender as assigned at birth on it. If somebody has already updated their documents and tries to renew their passport, they will be issued one with their gender assigned at birth on it. If the documentation that you present does not indicate that your gender is assigned at birth differs from how you present with your passport application, they are trying to make it incumbent on the employees of the State Department to obtain adequate evidence to prove that you are trans. Now, one of the questions that will also come up at this point is, well, if you've already got all of your supporting documents updated, what happens? How would they ever find out that you were trans? Unfortunately, there is a line on the passport application form that requires you to disclose any prior names that you have used. and you have an obligation under US law to fill that out accurately and completely, and you do sign to that effect when you submit your passport. So folks have a legal obligation to disclose any previous names they used, which can be a way that a lot of people would get outed during that process. Now, we do have a statement from the administration that's been repeated multiple times across multiple different platforms that currently they do not currently plan to revoke currently valid passports. That any passport that has been issued is valid up to its expiration date, but that upon renewal or if it's lost and has to be replaced, the replacement passport will contain the person's sex assigned at birth. We also had a development come up earlier this week when a diplomatic cable sent from the State Department to U.S. embassies and consulates around the world was made public, which mentioned that that visas for foreign travelers entering the United States would need to reflect the person's sex assigned at birth, regardless of the information on their passport. This is specifically targeted at athletes traveling with the intent of basically making it more difficult for trans athletes to compete in the 2028 Olympics. But the broader effect opens the door for restricting access for trans people to travel to the US on an accurate visa. For folks who aren't aware, when a visa is issued for travel to another country, it contains roughly the same sorts of information you'd expect to find in a passport or other identity document, including again, by international law, your gender or your sex. And contrary to the initial reaction that the leak of this cable had produced, this does not actually prohibit trans people from traveling to the US if they've changed their gender marker on their passport from another country. However, it does require that if they get a visa at a US embassy to travel to the US, that it might wind up with a different gender marker on it than is on that person's passport. This is something that is going to have varying impacts depending on the country that somebody is traveling from, because in the case of a lot of countries where there's basically an automatic tourist visa where you don't have to fill out advanced paperwork and things like that, it's just not really going to be relevant. You just cross the border, move in, conduct your visit, and then go home. That sort of thing is not going to be a problem. It's going to be a bigger problem for people who are traveling for work, for people who are traveling for extended periods, and it's going to have an impact potentially on the immigration process where trans people are coming to the U.S. attempting to immigrate to join family members who are in the U.S. So that is the landscape that we're looking at right now for trans people's documents for international travel. There is, not surprisingly, a lawsuit underway challenging this policy. The suit is ORR v. Trump, ORR v. Trump, which has been filed in the District Court in Massachusetts, the Federal District Court in Massachusetts. It is a class action suit representing not just the named clients, but all trans people who who want to change the gender marker on their passport and have or have not yet been denied. Full disclosure, the named plaintiff here, Lazarus Orr, is one of my coworkers, one of mine, Camille's coworkers at A4TE. The ACLU brought the suit. There are several filings that have been submitted, supporting documents. It has not yet moved to preliminary hearings, but we do expect that there will eventually be hearings, whether that will result in any sort of restraining order, stay, or injunction impacting the State Department, and how that will be complied with if it happens is currently an open question, but we're going to be keeping an eye on things. The other thing that we've seen is that the Trump administration has put out drafts of new versions of the passport application forms for public comment. For folks who aren't aware, whenever the administration takes certain kinds of actions, it's required to put those actions up for public comment. It's called notice and comment rulemaking. They give notice of something they're going to want to do, and the public has an opportunity to comment on it. These passport documents have to be put up for public comment because of the provisions of the Paperwork Reduction Act, and that as a result, there is a window currently open until March 17th for comment on the application for a new passport, and until March 20th for the application for a renewal of a passport or the application for a change of name on a passport that has been issued within the past year. So three different forms which people are able to comment on. The ACLU has already opened a comment portal that is open to the public for people to comment on their thoughts on these new passport forms that specifically do not allow trans people to update their gender markers and do not allow for an X marker anymore. We are also working with community. We at A4TE are also working with our community organizing contacts to put out comment portals to make sure that we're getting as broad an opportunity or a broad possibility out there for people to take advantage of this opportunity to comment. Because when the public comments on actions taken by a federal administration, the federal administration has a legal obligation to go through the comments, review them, and in some cases respond to them. So effectively, if folks were to provide comments on these portals, it would potentially slow down the introduction of these new passport forms with their transphobic reasoning on them and their exclusion of X markers. So that is the first of the three topics that I wanted to focus on today. Sarah, how are we doing on time?
We are 20 minutes after the hour.
Oh, great. Okay, we are going to have plenty of time to move through things here. Not great, because none of this is great, but I am glad to hear that we have plenty of time here, and I have not been there to taken up too much of everyone's time today. All right, so the second subject is military ban. This was an executive order that came out on January 27th, which contains some of the most vile and dehumanizing language that I've ever seen a politician use to describe trans people, stating that trans people lack the integrity and honesty and humility to serve in the military and to meet the standards of conduct required by the U.S. military. I am a Quaker. I am a pacifist by nature, and even I was appalled by this. It is one of the most disgusting ways to describe a trans service member. Now, again, looking at the history of trans service, we're all familiar with Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy that came into place in the 90s and was in effect until the early 2010s, which did not allow LGBTQ people to serve openly in the military. When that policy went away, it actually only went away completely for LGBT people. Trans people were still barred from open military service. Now, that's something that changed near the end of the Obama administration, where they adopted rules that allowed for trans people to serve openly in the military. And quite a few trans people came out immediately in response to that and began to transition with the support of their chain of command and with the support of their units. One thing that I always need to make clear when we're talking about trans military service is that studies conducted by the VA have shown that trans people serve in the military at a rate twice that of the general population. There's a lot of speculation as to why that is, but there are a lot of trans people who have served in the military and continue to serve in the military. Now, the folks that started to come out and transitioned medically, socially, and legally during the rules that were adopted in 2016 were able to do so for about 2 years before they ran into a major problem, which is that in mid-2017, apparently somebody informed Donald Trump of the existence of trans people in the military while he was doing whatever he does at 3 in the morning when he's on Twitter. And as a result, he tweeted out that effective immediately, we were going to get rid of the trans people in the military. It actually took until 2018 for a policy to be adopted that was actively hostile toward trans people in military service. That actually was not as terrible as it could have been. It allowed trans people who were already in the military, in many cases, to still continue to serve and to still continue with their medical transition and so on, but it didn't allow new people to join who were trans. This also had a really bad impact on the few trans cadets at the service academies or who were in ROTC and receiving scholarships. So for folks who aren't aware, if you attend a service academy or you get an ROTC scholarship, you sign a contract with an obligation to serve a certain number of years in the military afterward. And unfortunately, the folks who were in the service academies or in ROTC during this window reached the end of their contract, the education requirement for their contract, and then weren't accepted for military service, which meant they were then obliged to pay back their scholarship or to pay back the cost of their education at Annapolis or whatever other service academy they were in, which has been a huge burden on people because, frankly, even in the civilian world, if you go up to folks and say, yes, I'm a graduate of Annapolis, I'm a graduate of West Point. No, I never actually served in the military. That's going to raise questions. And, having anything other than an honorable discharge from the military, it has a stigma attached to it, even in civilian life. And so you've got a lot of folks who had committed to serve their country and then were turned down at the last minute and had this huge burden put upon them and had this stigma put upon them of not having served for whatever reason. Now, shortly after President Biden took office in 2021, he issued an executive order reversing that policy and allowing trans people to serve openly. As a result, we had trans people serving openly in the military for about 4 years. Again, with the support of their chain of command, the support of their units, receiving medical care, including transition-related care, through the same procedures they would for any other medical care through the military, with no objections to their legal transitions and so on. And then on January 27th, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order that announced that it was going to put an end to open trans military service. And again, doing so in some of the most vile language that you can possibly have. As a result, for about a month, trans people in the military have been in limbo, not sure what's going on with their futures, whether they're about to be discharged, when they'd be discharged, what that discharge would look like. And it has been incredibly stressful for pretty much every trans person in the military or in the veteran community that I or anybody else at A4TE has spoken to. Last night, we finally got an answer to what that is going to look like. So a lawsuit was filed shortly after this executive order went out called Talbot v. Trump. It was filed in district court in the District of Columbia. And there was a hearing on that last week. Some folks might have seen some of the transcript of that. The judge was not really having the government's arguments. She was not putting up with them and was really taking them to task for the illogical and unscientific arguments they were bringing to her court. Anyway, one result of that was that once the final memo issuing the new policy came out, it had to be filed with that ongoing lawsuit and filed in the court system, which is how we got access to it. Because again, this administration just does things in the most haphazard and frustrating way you might ever imagine if you're trying to get any information. Almost like that's their deliberate intent. Which meant that late last night we got to see this memo with the policy on basically the policy invoking a ban on military service by trans people. We're still picking apart all of the nuances and implications of this policy because, like everything that has come out of this administration, it is incredibly poorly structured and vague in places where you would generally want precision. That said, this is a much more sweeping ban than we ever had under the first Trump administration. It is stating that all trans people need to be identified, who are currently in active duty or the reserves in the military need to be identified, and separation procedures begun for them immediately. There is some language in there providing for exceptions in certain cases of military leave, but in those cases, those people would be required to comply with the grooming requirements, medical standards, physical standards, and terms of address associated with their sex assigned at birth, regardless of their status, the status of their medical, social, or legal transitions. We are not expecting that a lot of waivers are going to be granted under this policy. It's probably just to cover their butts in case they realize that there was a trans person in a significantly load-bearing role that they don't want to lose immediately, and instead they just want to make them miserable before they finally find somebody to replace them in that position. The rules are actually not as terrible as they could be. For instance, folks who have at least 18 years in service are going to be allowed to take advantage of early retirement, so they'd still be able to retain the benefits that they've earned over time. Can voluntarily choose separation, which will give them some pretty nice benefits, like administrative leave pay, basically getting them in a situation where they're going to have an easier transition out of the military than they might have had elsewhere, or if they did, or they might have had under the previous don't ask, don't tell policies. Um, it also does cover one of the issues that we had, pardon me, under the 2018 policy, which is that it does not require people who are discharged or who are not inducted into the military after graduating from a service academy to pay back any obligations. So the folks who are going to be most badly impacted by this policy are not going to be as badly impacted as they might have been otherwise. That is some very, very small comfort, though, for the people who've dedicated their lives to serving this country in the military, especially given that many of them transitioned because of a promise, transition medically, socially, and legally because of a promise that was made to them by the government that their service was welcomed, accepted, and appreciated. And that they're not being treated this way is just appalling on every level that I can imagine. Now, there are two lawsuits currently ongoing challenging this in the federal courts. First I mentioned was Talbot v. Trump, which is in the District of Columbia, and then there's also Schilling v. Trump, which is in the Western District of Washington. What's going to end up happening with those, especially given we have a federal court system that is not looking particularly friendly to trans people right now, is anybody's guess. We are watching these as they proceed, and we're going to keep the community updated as we learn more about them. But right now, we're in a situation where trans service members and trans veterans are being openly attacked and treated with just appalling disdain by the government that they've taken an oath to serve. Now, I want to move on to healthcare attacks, which is the third of the main topics that we're going to talk about today. The day after the military ban executive order came out on January 28th, because apparently we are just not allowed to get a day's break at that week. We got another order, which is an attack on access to best practice transition-related healthcare for trans youth. Trans youth in this case is being defined as anybody under the age of 19. Much like with the military ban, the language that was used in this executive order was incredibly inflammatory, appallingly insulting, and it's just gross. I'm sorry, I could look up all the euphemisms in the world, but it's just gross. We went through, and in the interest of kind of being able to explain this policy to people without them having to wade through the pages of terrible rhetoric, we put together another explainer document in coordination with other organizations. I'm dropping a link to that in the chat. That gives you kind of a point-by-point breakdown of what the executive order does, and also kind of a general explanatory document of the impacts this is going to have, potentially have. Now, this document attempts to put a halt on all transition-related medical care for anybody under the age of 18, or anybody under the age of 19. It does this the way that the federal government will often do, try to impose rules on state and local entities, and that's by trying to threaten access to federal funds. So what they're basically saying throughout this order is that a hospital or medical center or clinic that provides transition-related medical care to anybody under the age of 19 would ultimately, once all of the requirements of the executive order were put into place, would not have access to federal funds for research. Admittedly, all those have been also hacked to pieces by Elon Musk, but research for Medicare and Medicaid, and potentially for other programs like potentially even pardon me, it has been a very long week. Potentially even marketplace insurance plans. In addition, any training programs for medical providers would not be able to use federal funds if they discussed transition-related medical care. And it directs the Department of Health and Human Services to adopt policies implementing these requirements. Now, one of the questions that comes up is why 19? Why not 18? And there's a lot of speculation about why that is. The most likely one is that the age of 19 comes up as a cutoff a lot in Medicaid. And so that is likely the reason why it was chosen as the cutoff here. Um, as a result, right now we've got folks in a really frustrating state of limbo, much like people in the military were, where, you know, their exact rights are unclear. Now, the biggest problem that we had with healthcare was actually not the federal action. It was with the preemptive compliance that we saw from medical providers. Almost immediately, a lot of hospitals decided to set aside their ethical obligation to their patients and instead put their fear of potentially losing federal funds in the future once new policies were adopted ahead of that. And as a result, a lot of hospitals immediately began canceling appointments for transition-related care for anybody under the age of 19. There was a lawsuit filed almost immediately. That is a recurring trend with almost anything the Trump administration did in 2016 to 2020, and it will continue to be a recurring trend. PFLAG v. Trump was filed in the district court in Maryland and had a hearing 2 weeks ago today, if I recall correctly, in which the judge put in a temporary restraining order because, again, the obvious bias that was at play in this rule. And as a result, we saw several medical centers resume treatment or adopt policies that were along the lines of, we'll continue treatment for existing patients, but aren't going to take on any new patients under the age of 19. As a result, we've got kind of an awkward situation that's pending the outcome of what happens with this litigation. Two of the reasons why we have this kind of extra fear on the part of medical providers, though, first off, is the potential of being cut off from federal funds through Medicare and Medicaid. But also, one of the things that this executive order pushes is that they want Congress to adopt a law that would create a right to bring a private right of an individual to bring a malpractice case against a doctor who had provided transition-related medical care to somebody 19 or under the age of 19 with an incredibly long statute of limitations going on the order of decades. So basically, retroactively opening up providers to malpractice suits by somebody who was not happy about something with their care from 10, 15 years ago. Obviously, that's something that has not happened yet. That would need to be introduced in Congress, pass both houses of Congress, and then be signed by the president before it would become law. But the fear of this potentially happening has scared several healthcare providers into canceling appointments. Now, we are expecting that we're going to continue to have legal challenges coming forward, especially as Health and Human Services begins to implement the various requirements of this executive order. One of the first actions that we saw when RFK Jr. took over as Health and Human Services Secretary last week was a launch of their attack on trans people, particularly on trans women, because they decided to frame things in terms of sports participation, which the obsession with trans women playing sports is incredibly frustrating, because let me tell you, if trans women inherently had an athletic advantage because of having a testosterone-based puberty, every single person who tried to recruit me for a pickup basketball game would not have walked away so disappointed. It's a ridiculous obsession, but it's the one they're fixated on. And that's even how they're framing their attacks on access to medical care. So we are expecting to see, number one, cutting of funds to federally qualified health centers that provide transition-related medical care to people of all ages, potentially. We're expecting to see an attempt to restrict access to the medications used for medical transition, both puberty pausing medication and hormone therapy, so things like anti-androgens, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. We're expecting to see some attacks on that. We've already seen kind of a prelude to what that might look like by the attempts to restrict off-label prescription of medication. trying to make it sound like it's scary and dangerous and somehow bad, when in fact most medications are prescribed off-label because the specific on-label uses for things are incredibly restrictive and would technically eliminate a lot of common uses for common medications. It's a ridiculous argument, but we're expecting to see that invoked to restrict access to care. We've also seen a willingness by anti-trans lawmakers and elected officials around the country to misuse some of the existing resources that are out there that are not only supposed to protect people and their access to healthcare, to attack trans people's access to care. For instance, we've seen in multiple jurisdictions attacks on providers of care, most notably in Texas, that seem to be coming from people who are misusing the data that's collected by pharmacy monitoring systems that are trying to keep track of the prescription of, well, things like combating like opioid addiction and opioid abuse by tracking prescription drug use around the country. Instead, using that for innocuous drugs like testosterone or estrogen in order to try to track down what doctors are prescribing care for trans people. We're also seeing a willingness to abuse HIPAA. Everyone's probably aware HIPAA obviously protects health information privacy. Unfortunately, it has a very, very large loophole, I guess you could say, even though it's intentional rather than an unintentional loophole, that allows for the government to access HIPAA protected information if it's pursuant to certain kinds of criminal and civil investigatory action by the state government. And we have seen in multiple jurisdictions, most notably Tennessee, we've seen attorneys general issue orders demanding that personal information about people's healthcare be provided to the government by clinics that have provided transition-related care. Oh, sorry, I saw the chat. Off-label versus on.
Sorry.
Okay. So I will say up front, I am not the best person in the world when it comes to medical care. We have that person working for us. Unfortunately, she's not on this call at the moment. But I will try to explain this as best I can. Actually, in my bio, when I talk about corporate law, I actually worked in the biotech industry briefly on medical care for dengue fever, a completely unrelated world, very weird one, but I got to know the FDA approvals process really close up. So basically, when you've got a drug that you want to bring to market, thank you for the explanation there in the link there. But yeah, basically, when you have a drug you want to bring to market, you have to bring it to market for specific reasons, for specific use cases. So we'll have a drug that, actually, you know what? I'm going to pick one that is near and dear to the hearts of many trans women. Spironolactone. Spironolactone is a blood pressure medication. Its method of action is fascinating because the way that it works as a blood pressure medication is it causes you to shed sodium in your urine. It basically takes all the salt out of your blood and drops it out through your kidneys. That means that it is a great blood pressure medication. But hey, that's its main indication. That's the thing that it was mostly meant for. That was primary on-label use. Eventually, someone realized, well, wait a minute, this has this effect of, in a slightly larger dose, causing you to pee a lot more. Well, so they went and was like, hey, we got a second on-label use for this, which is it can be used as a diuretic if somebody's having urinary problems. So they'll prescribe a mild dose for blood pressure, a larger dose for people who are having urinary problems. And at some point along the line, I don't know the exact history on this, somebody realized, well, wait a second, this is also having the effect of suppressing testosterone levels. And so they got approval from the FDA to use this as an on-label use to suppress testosterone levels in cisgender men who are undergoing therapy for certain kinds of testicular and prostate cancers that are primarily fed by testosterone. I'm not a scientist. I'm trying to, and as a result, this is kind of the main anti-androgen that got used for a very long time in that window, for that purpose. So that means that if you've got a large dose in your system, it's suppressing your testosterone level. It also means you really have to pee a lot. Your blood pressure is really low. So it has some annoying side effects. But somebody realized, well, hey, up until this point, this is back in the 90s when somebody realized this, hey, we've just been giving trans women estrogen in order to boost their estrogen levels and suppress their testosterone, and it's not really very effective by itself. What if we combine it with this other drug, spironolactone? And as a result, they started putting trans women on a larger dose of spironolactone, which brought testosterone levels down, which meant that we could get the estrogen levels that we needed for medical transition with a lower dosage of estrogen, which is easier on the liver because every drug that you take, regardless of whether it's something really complex or something incredibly innocuous like vitamin C, it eventually goes through your liver. And when you're on complex medications, you want to simplify that as much as you can. Now, technically speaking, the FDA never gave direct approval to use spironolactone as an anti-androgen for trans women for purposes of medical transition. So technically, that's an off-label use, despite the fact that using it to suppress testosterone levels in cisgender men who have testicular and prostate cancer does the same effective thing within the body. That's an on-label use. So it's basically doing the same thing, but for a different reason, which makes it on-label versus off-label in this case. Now, I understand that we're recording this and we're putting this up on YouTube. If anybody has actually gotten this far and I got this terribly wrong, please don't tear me apart too much in the comments. I am an attorney and a liberal arts major before that. I am not a scientist, but that is a very general explanation of what that means in this context.
Thank you, Olivia. Olivia, real quick, I just wanted to check and see, give a time check. We're at 46 minutes into the hour, and we have a bunch of questions, so whenever you're ready.
All right, well, I was going to kind of finish off this conversation, and we can go to questions. So just to kind of put it in further context, every single medication that exists on the market right now has on-label usage and is prescribed by a doctor for off-label usage because it's what's right for the patient, kind of patient-centered care, where it's like we're not really worried with what things should look like in a textbook example. We're worried about what effect it has on the person. So all of the medications that trans people might get as part of their medical transition are things that were approved for use for cisgender people. And I'm going to make a point here about puberty pausing medications. Some people call them puberty blockers. That's really inaccurate. That's not what they do. They get talked about as a very frightening thing, saying they're untested. They don't, we don't know what they do. They're scary. They're dangerous. They're experimental. They're not. Puberty pausing medications have been around since the 1980s, and they were originally introduced and still are primarily used for cisgender youth who are undergoing precocious puberty or who are having some sort of medical issues associated with puberty where there's a desire to pause that impact until they've received treatment for something else until they go through. So this controversial medication that people are willing to, upend all sorts of laws over its use by trans people is actually used on label by cis people all the time with no problem to do the exact same thing. But because it's doing the exact same thing for a different reason, it's an off-label use. So I hope I got that in a way that was understandable and also did not butcher the science behind all of this too much. That means a lot to me because all of my experience with spironolactone was having been on it. So that is really good to know that I got that more or less right. Okay, so we have questions apparently.
We have so many questions. So I'm gonna, I know Glow has a whole compilation of them. I'm going to ask this one first. I just saw it come in and I saw a couple of people agreed that it was a good question to ask. So travel and re-entering, what should people expect? And that is also related, like if someone has a marker that's different than their marker at birth, what should they expect? Also, what are your recommendations around the X marker? Is there a risk of being detained on re-entry or having your documentation taken away? Yeah, there's a whole slew of questions in that arena. So let's compile that into one.
Okay, so what's going on with re-entry is it's kind of a complicated question because while we have some statements from the administration on passport validity, we're still sort of in a limbo period where there haven't been a lot of people who have traveled and have had either negative or positive experiences and have communicated them out publicly. So I'm sure there are a lot of people who have crossed the border with an X marker on their passport since January 20th. But we haven't heard any particular stories about this. So right now, this is one of those situations where silence on that front combined with the statement from the administration that validly issued passports will continue to be valid, leads us to believe that, at least for the time being, people entering the country on a US passport that has a gender marker that differs from their gender assigned at birth, or specifically has an X marker on it, are not having specific problems. That's something that we're monitoring as best we can to keep an eye on. And if that changes, we're going to let people know. But this is, again, a situation where, they say it's like absence of evidence. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But in this case, because we're not hearing negative stories, we can tentatively conclude that there's not a lot bad happening in that arena right now. Now, two things we're fairly confident of, just based on what we know about how these systems work, is that when somebody presents a passport, I used to actually have mine on the desk and I would use it as a visual aid, and then I actually used it to enter a courthouse. But anyway, it's not here anymore. Otherwise, I'd be waving that around instead of just flailing my hand. But when you present your passport to a TSA agent or a CBP agent, Border Patrol agent, when you're coming in through the when you're coming into the country, as far as we know, what we understand is that the information that's visible on your passport is the only information that is visible to them. So they don't get like an automatic pull up to say, hey, this person previously had a passport in a different name with a different gender marker. And as far as we know, there's not a way for the system as it's currently built and the database as it currently exists to generate that information. So it's unlikely that somebody will be outed by their documents traveling, or that it will be easily visible to somebody who might be viewing them in that context, that there had been a previously issued document with differing information on. Now, we are also wondering about foreign travelers, people traveling into the US on another country's validly issued passport, especially one who has an X marker. Again, we haven't heard any negative stories yet. Evidence of absence is not, or absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But again, we can kind of tentatively infer that people aren't having that kind of trouble yet, just because we're not hearing negative stories about that yet.
Okay. Yeah, fabulous. I think that was a really thorough answer. Glo, do you have any questions that like repeat multiple times so we can prioritize that? Have you seen any questions that are like asked by more than one person?
Yeah, there's just a request to add the link for the comments we can write on our passport notice for or on the proposed new passport forms, if we can drop the link in the chat.
Let me see if I can find that for y'all.
People are also asking questions about applying for a passport for the first time after changing a gender marker or for future renewals. Do you have any idea about what they are cross-checking when you apply for, and you did mention this a little bit earlier with the needing to acknowledge previous names and et cetera. This person asked, in reports I read, trans people who've been unable to change their marker have either had a passport as a child or haven't changed their birth certificate. Is there any indication they're checking the Social Security database, or is there any other way that they're catching those things? Like, for example, I have heard of a few different folks in Southern California even who are having their documents taken away when they apply for a renewal. So I'm just wondering on that front, and it sounds like other folks are. What is that looking like?
All right. So the first part of that about applying for a first time with entirely updated documents. We do not have any concrete examples of people who have done that since January 21st and gotten their passport. There are a few people who had actually been at the passport agency on the 20th who had not gotten their passports yet, and I'm trying to follow up with them to find out what has happened to see if they managed to sneak in there. If folks are aware of people who do have that happen, please let us know. But I also understand a lot of people who might have done that might want to keep quiet about it for fear of drawing attention to themselves, because we have seen that there's a willingness by this administration and by anti-trans lawmakers and policymakers in general to rescind validly issued documents to trans people if they're not happy with how that person got the correct marker on it. So As far as what's happening with people's documents, that's kind of an up in the air thing because the passport agency has actually never been consistent about what happens with your documents when you submit them. Most of the time, they would copy them and return them to you, and they'd usually be mailed separately. Sometimes they would copy them and return them to you, and they'd be mailed together with your passport. They're not supposed to be, but they are. Um, Other times, they would retain the document for their record. I got 10 copies of my name change order when I changed my name. And the only entity that I changed my name with that kept a copy of my name change order was the passport agency. Um, I don't know if they were supposed to or not, but they did. This was 10 years ago, so I didn't really worry about it at that time. So that's kind of an interesting question of what happened to that. Was there a document retention policy that led to it being shredded? I don't know. And unfortunately, the State Department has always been very tight-lipped about a lot of their internal policies for security reasons. As a result, there's a lot of this where the answer is we're just not entirely sure. Now, we do know there are stories of people who had their documents returned to them defaced, but that seems to be more unusual. Most of the time, it seems to be people's documents are either not being returned to them or being returned to them intact separately. The other kind of wrinkle to this is that in the past, there has been a policy that if you submit a passport application and it is rejected for whatever reason, that they would retain the supporting documents that you sent in with that. And the problem is because the State Department's policy has wavered so much over the years, that means a lot of what's happening to your individual documents isn't even the policy, it is the individual person who is handling your documents and what they know the policy to be. And this is something that comes up a lot with the public-facing federal entities. TSA is notorious for this. Social Security Administration branch offices as well, where they'll adopt good policies, but they won't bother to educate their frontline staff about those policies, so they don't know that a policy necessarily has changed. As a result, it's been hard to draw conclusions about what the current document policies are because the State Department won't tell us, and because it has varied so much in application over the years, we just don't know. I hate to always have to include a we just don't know, but sometimes, unfortunately, that's the answer.
Sure. Um, Another question was, do you have an opinion on whether people should go forward with a gender change on a real ID or driver's license document?
So, generally speaking, at the moment, okay, that's a really complicated question. I'll be honest. It's a really complicated question because it always comes down to individual safety. Like what is the thing that makes you as an individual safest in this moment? And that's going to be a different answer for each person. And that's something that people have to consider. Like, what is your local community? What will presenting a document with that marker mean to you in this context? And so it's hard to give a general explanation. If I were to give general advice to people in a very much this is not legal advice situation, but just sort of if you know what's the better option, it's update your state ID if you're able to, because right now there is nothing that this administration has done yet that has impacted the ability of states to issue a real ID compliant document with the correct gender mark. They have not yet taken any action that would change that, but they could attempt to take action to change that. And so if your situation allows for you to be in your immediate moment personally safe, changing the document now is good because we unfortunately don't know what the access to change documents is going to look like later. And much like a passport, a driver's license or a state ID is valid for longer than President Trump is constitutionally allowed to remain in office. And so if you've got that document now, that's something that you get to keep holding. But again, it comes down to your own personal safety. If you feel that having a document with a corrected marker on it is not going to be safe for you to have in your local community, then it's something you maybe don't want to consider doing. And that's something that each person has to answer for themselves. I, as a national advocate, can't answer that for each person.
Thank you for that answer. I really appreciate it and think it's so important to underscore, like, ultimately it's about each person's what's going to make you feel the safest. So we are at the end of our time. We have a bunch more questions. And so what we'd like to do is we've talked with some of the A4TE team. We're going to try and compile a amalgamated list of questions and just get a few answers, and then we can both send them out to our lists in the follow-up email. Um, in the meantime, I just want to thank you, Olivia, for all of your expertise and for your amazing handling of the topics at hand, and your ability to shed light for us on the topics that are important and near and dear to each of us. So thank you so much for your time and energy, Olivia. It's been really great working with you and your team, and we look forward to more in the future. And yeah, it's just been really great. Everybody's giving you lots of thanks and gratitude in the chat. Yeah, so thanks so much. All right, and thanks to everybody for showing up. We had like close to 200 people in here, I think. So, and we'll get it up on the channel, and we'll share that link with A4TE so you can send that out to your crew as well. So, all right, thank you. All right, I'm going to end the recording.